Hello, hello, I'm Ghost, I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking about analog horror, a piece of the horror culture that I used to be quite immersed in back when I was younger. I love analog horror. It's a big reason why I'm so into the genre of horror now, and without it, I think that I really wouldn't be doing what I do here on YouTube, which is interesting because I haven't really talked about it much outside of some controversies in the scene. But I never really talk about the actual, just strictly the media itself. So I thought I'd give a little bit of a beginner's guide to it because I've been into it for quite some time and I know a good amount of series. This is largely being made out of the dead body of a video that was going to be an iceberg on Internet Horror, which had a bunch of series, both analog and not, that were created on the internet. But I'm scrapping the video because a bunch of the series just kept blowing up. So all the stuff that we had at lower tiers did not work anymore, which was unfortunate. But I thought that it would be worth talking about these series, and I hope you enjoy my video. And hopefully, if you're already into analog horror, maybe you'll have some fun with this. And if you're not, hopefully I can give you some good starting places and some stuff you should check out eventually as well. So let's get to it. I'm going to cut the bullshit and let's talk about analog horror. So the originals, I only am going to talk about two. And there's really one that's the real original. January 16th, 2016, the first episode of CHSS was dropped onto YouTube, or the first installment, really, titled Advertisement 1. And I don't believe that the creators knew how important this was going to be. CHSS is considered to be the first analog horror series there ever was. While definitely missing some of the trademarks, it was quite clearly the starting point for everything that is in the genre today. And it really is quite good, taking this idea of a news station and just going in a lot of interesting directions with it. It's not necessarily a downright terrifying series, but it's definitely an off-putting experience, and I think that it's really interesting to check out. I don't want to spoil this one too much, because I feel like it's definitely a good starting point if you're trying to get into analog horror. It's the first one, so it's pretty accessible, and each individual installment is extremely short. There's just a lot of them. But it's an interesting piece, and I think that it's very, very valuable to talk about. I don't think that I should deep dive into it. I have a lot I want to get through today, but there are videos on it if you don't necessarily feel like watching through the entire series, but want to learn more about the origin of the genre. The other that I'd like to talk about as an original example of the genre is Local 58. October 31st, 2017, the first episode of Local 58 was aired. Not aired, dropped onto YouTube. Sorry, sometimes I forget I'm just too cool for words. Anyway, so the first episode of Local 58 was called Local 58 TV. You are on the fastest available network. And Local 58 is very clearly, heavily inspired by CH. It's this weird, creepy news station with a lot of uncomfortable stuff going on. Personally, the episode I remember most, I'm trying to remember which one it was. Just put it on screen. My editor will have it on screen right now. Basically, it was just a normal broadcast, but then it turned into it was interrupted by an emergency broadcast saying, "We lost a war that the general public didn't know about. Our bad, sorry, but even when we lose, we don't really lose. Go out and kill..." I can't say that on YouTube, I don't think. Engage in super slide, and also finish off your children too, so that the enemy may not get us. And it ends with a, "Sorry, we didn't mean to air that, that's our bad. Yay!" Which is kind of creepy, considering that That could probably be a thing. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some wars we have no clue are going on. And imagine if that happens, if one day you're just watching fucking Mickey Mouse Clubhouse with your kid, and out of nowhere the show gets interrupted and they're like, hey, we screwed up big time and we're all fucked now. So you should probably do something about the situation of your family and yourselves, just because then they can't get you. Yeah, sorry about that. Like, imagine if that happened. There's no way that the public knew prior, and then out of nowhere this bombshells dropped. I mean, it's a freaky concept. It's definitely bothersome. To me, Local 58 is honestly one of the more off-putting analog horror series out there. But also it's extremely important, because it takes essentially the ideas of CHSS, but it expands upon them and creates more what analog horror is now today. Local 58 is the closest original to modern analog horror. And it's also quite a good series, so I thought that was also worth mentioning in the originators section. But now I'd like to quickly move on and go to...
The mighty rabbit tries to find a way out of the cage, but it's unsuccessful. The rabbit keeps trying to find a way out, or at least catch...
So, for me, the big ones are Squimpus McGrimpus's The FNAF VHS Tapes, Martin Wall's The Walton Files, and Alex Kister's The Mandela Catalog. July 25th, 2019, the first of the FNAF VHS tape videos was dropped onto YouTube by Squimpus McGrimpus, and it was rather successful, and the reason that it is one of the juggernauts of analog horror is because you're taking this well-known franchise and you're creating stuff that definitely fits into the game, but reaches much darker and more uncomfortable points than the game do in an interesting way. To me, the FNAF VHS tapes, while never a favorite, are just a really, really good entry-level piece of analog horror, because it's just pure analog horror with characters that, chances are, if you're trying to get into analog horror, you're probably aware of. It's an interesting series, and there's a reason it's one of the juggernauts. It's got a very high level of quality, and its story unfolds very interestingly and naturally. I mean, you can tell just by the cultural impact. Go to the first one, and go to the description, and see all the shorts remixing it. There's a lot, man. So I think that it's quite interesting how successful Squimpus McGrimpus's The FNAF VHS Tapes series is. Especially considering that, at the time, no one really gave a rat's ass about analog horror. It was kind of still just underground. So the fact that it gained this much attention is actually quite interesting. And to me, it was the first of the analog horror series that truly started gaining a real solid following. That being said, I do have to quickly get out of the way that no, I do not support anything this guy has done. He's been accused of being a creepo, and I don't know, like, jack shit about the allegations, to be perfectly plain with you. It came out long after I was done with my time with the FNAF VHS tapes. I'll have my editor just throw something up on screen that's just like, hey, this is what this is, in like 2 sentences from something, but I don't really know much about it. I hear he's probably a bad guy, so I do feel the need to get off my chest that no, I do not support him in that regard. Next we'll be talking about The Walton Files, which is an absolutely fantastically done series, if I do say so myself, taking inspiration from FNAF and the FNAF VHS tapes, but creating its own entirely original story about an animatronic restaurant place where the story reaches much darker points than that of the FNAF series. To me, Walton Files is a really, really unforgiving and yet really, really polished and interesting series. I mean, it's a very, very large one, but it absolutely deserves it. It's got an interesting art style, its story unfolds extremely satisfyingly. All the characters are actually interesting, just the way that everything is directed and flows just works very well. And its influence on modern analog horror is quite clear. I mean, the Mandela Catalog, which it's likely you've heard of, would not exist without the Wallen Files. He's actually claimed that it was, in fact, one of the major inspirations. The Wallen Files was one of his major inspirations for creating the Mandela Catalog, which I find is pretty interesting. The Wallen Files is another easy entry-level one, but it's also one of the most popular for a fucking reason. I mean, the quality is just about unparalleled in the scene, and I say that without much doubt in my mind. It's a very just well-done series, and it's really quite interesting, and I found myself very immersed. All the acting is well done. It is definitely worth checking out. Last, I'd like to talk about the Mandela Catalog, which I've briefly spoken about, but that was when I was talking about analog horror controversy, which you don't really need to know about right now, because we're just talking about the Mandela Catalog. Released on June 9th, 2021, the Mandela Catalog hit the analog horror scene, and the fucking series is massive now. Here's the thing, right? The Mandela Catalog's a really interesting series, because it's the culmination of all these pre-existing tropes into one thing, but throw in just a really interesting, off-putting, creepy story about deformed, clone-like creatures of you and everyone else, essentially terrorizing the world. It's just creepy as fuck it when it wants to be, you know? It's a really good piece of analog horror, just because, once again, its story is told exceptionally competently, which is important to analog horror, but seriously, the creators of this series know exactly what they're doing. I mean, it's just really well executed. I really don't have much to say about it beyond that. If you're interested in getting into analog horror, personally, of the things I've spoken about already, I think that Wallen Files is the best to start with, but Mandela certainly isn't bad to start with either. The two of them are both so monstrously popular that you'll have people to talk about them with, but also they're not so insanely bizarre or creepy or overly tropey that they're just good ways of introducing yourself to the genre. May 23rd, 2020, Boisvert, or Boisvert, however the hell you want to pronounce it, hit the scene, and to this day, it is one of the greatest pieces of horror I've ever seen. This is my favorites category. These are some things that not necessarily are all-time essentials, nor originators of the genre, but they're highly quality pieces that I personally really enjoy and or resonate with. And Boisvert's really the best example of this. For whatever reason, Boisvert really struck an emotional chord with me. I don't really know why. It's not like I fully understood what was happening. I had my clues, but I'm not like... I didn't have a full grip, but just for whatever reason, Boisvert made me feel very understood and very seen. And I think that it's a really interesting story. Seemingly it starts off just as, you know, this is COVID and it sucks and let's make some spooky stuff about it and talk about how it's affecting me a little bit. But it grows much deeper than that, and it's really interesting. I also want to take a moment to applaud how stylized Boisvert is. I mean, you can look at it and it's like absolutely nothing else in the entire scene. No one's even dared to try and copy its style. It's just so unique and beautiful and interesting. Boisvert/Boisvert, again, however you want to pronounce it, is a really great piece of horror. Not just analog horror. And I absolutely adore it. If you haven't checked it out, you absolutely need to. Because they're just really unique in the scene. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're beginner level. I'd probably check out a couple of the other series I've talked about before you reach them. But once you've liked a series or two of analog horror, I think that it's definitely worth checking out Boisvert, as when I did, I absolutely fell in love with the series. It's just so interesting. And it's a deep inspiration to me. I actually have Dog Nightmares, which I almost applied for a voice acting role in, But then I was like, oh, I can't, because there was an age thing at the time. So I was very deeply disappointed. So hey, Piggy Soda, you're the creator of Dog Nightmares. I like Jack Stauber too, and I don't know if Piggy Soda's a Primus reference, pork soda, but I like Primus. I'd love to voice act. Sorry, bad moment. Anyways, Dog Nightmares, right? It's a really interesting piece of analog horror that I quite enjoy, and I'd like to briefly go over it. So, Dog Nightmares is based off of the advertisement shorts series thing, the Wegman Dogs, and Dog Nightmares is really interesting. Basically, this person loses their dog, so they're looking for it, but turns out that this weird human-dog thing is stalking them. And, that's a bummer, and it may or may not have taken the dog, at least that's what you're made to think. And, yeah, man, I can't really go into detail without spoiling too much, so I'm leaving it up to you to actually go out and watch it. Again, I'm just trying to get you to be aware today. I don't want to do any deep dives and spoil anything or overwhelm you with information. I'm here to come in, give you some series to check out, and fuck off. And Dog Nightmares is a really great series that I think is really interesting. It's another one which has an undeniable style to it. And it's just a well-crafted show. It's rare that you'll feel bored during it, if you will at all. And it's just interesting. Quite plainly, Dog Nightmares is just interesting. This is also one of the ones that I had on the iceberg back when they had like 2,000 views. And then, stuff like Scare Theater made videos on them, and they exploded, which is great for them. But also, damn it, I should have made that iceberg, like, back when I had the idea years ago. Oh well, it is what it is. Dog Nightmares I highly advise you check out. It's a really interesting piece of media, and I hope you like it if you do check it out. Next, I'm going to actually briefly hand it over to my editor, who's going to tell you about Lacey's Flash Games.
Hello, I'm British now.
No, you're not.
Anyway, I'm here to talk about Lacey's Flash Games. So, Lacey's Flash Games is kind of in a subgenre of analog horror called digital horror, which basically focuses more on digital nostalgia, including, like, Flash games, for example, Lacey's Flash Games. And it also includes stuff like Chess Kids and Bugbo, and it's a whole thing. But Lacey's Flash Games is my personal favorite, and I think one of the best analog horror series out there. The interesting thing about Lacey's Flash Games is the fact that there's so little content so far, but also there's so much. There's the first video, obviously, and you've probably seen the first two videos. Of basically these dark and disturbing Flash games with basically, the first one kind of ends with cannibalism, and the second one also has cannibalism. And there are two other videos of Lacey's Pet Shop and then the disturbing rabbit hole of Lacey's Games, which is basically Lacey's beauty parlor. The interesting thing about Lacey's Flash Games is each one is its own separate entity, but also very much connected by an overarching narrative. Basically, each episode explains part of issues of living with mental illness or just being a female and having to live to beauty standards, or, when it comes to mentally ill people trying to run businesses or stuff like that. And I think it's genuinely an important and very well-crafted show. Lacey's Flash Games is one of the only analog horror series where I actively return to it, to episodes I've already watched, just because there's always at least one tiny thing that you miss every single time you watch it. And the creator absolutely has more planned, and I'm super excited for that. And while I still think Walton is personally my favorite analog horror series, I'm going to say that in due time, Lacey's has the ability to beat it. And I'm very excited to see where the series moves forward. And I highly recommend Lacey's Flash Games as one of the first digital horror / analog horror series that you watch.
Hi, it's me again. And before I get back to it, I would like to briefly mention this. The Walton Files, since my editor did just mention that it is one of his favorites, if not his favorite, I would like to say that The Walton Files is one of, if not my favorite, analog horror series as well. Certainly one of. The only reason I neglect to mention it now under this is because I just spoke about it in the previous section. That being said, if that's even more convincing, yeah, there you go. That's just a little bit of extra. Anyway, I'd like to talk about one more very, very briefly, as this is a newer one. But it's one that I've actually found a lot of interest in as of late, and that's The Man in the Suit, which is a Godzilla-themed analog horror made by a teenager. If I recall, they're like 15 right now, 14, something like that. And I just think it's really interesting that someone so young has been able to create such a good piece of analog horror. I'm not kidding when I say this dude's just making this stuff for fun, and it's genuinely rivaling some of the stuff with real fucking money behind it and like teams of people. Man in the Suit's just a well-made series. It certainly doesn't have the polish of some other bigger series, but it's just really interesting, and it knows what it wants to be, and it is exactly that, and I find that respectable. What it wants to do, it does, and it does so very well. So, yeah, Man in the Suit, I think, is honestly worth checking out. I don't want to talk about it too much, because I want you to figure out what it's about and everything yourself. But all of the ones that I'm talking about here will be in the description, and hopefully I get you to at least check out one series you haven't already. Well, now that I've been positive, it's time to channel my negativity and talk about a handful of the ones that you should probably avoid when you're getting into analog horror. We're gonna start off with probably the one you're most likely to hear about nice and early, and the topic that was actually the first thing I spoke about when changing up my format from gaming videos multiple years ago to the videos I do now, these weird, creepy, off-putting ones, which is Urban Spook. Hey man, in the chance that you're watching this, how you doing? It's been a little while. Yeah, so Urban Spook, the thing about his series is that it's not really home to many of the things you want in analog horror. Urban Spook's analog horror essentially relies around police investigation of a serial killer who kills people and paints them, and that's really the extent of it. You'll see paintings flash up on screen, you'll read those captions, and congratulations, there you go, you've experienced Urban Spook. It's entirely reliant on shock value, so I'm not gonna sit here and be like, man, you should check it out. I mean, there's a reason it's in the not suggest category. The thing about Urban Spook is, yeah, a lot of his stuff is just plain shock value. That's really all it is. But there is layers to even shock value based horror, and there is stuff there, and his art is cool. So while I don't necessarily think that he's a great analog horror creator, follow him on Instagram and see his art. That's honestly what I have to say. His series is one you should avoid. It does not reflect the world of analog horror. It's really its own thing, and its popularity is kind of unfortunate, but it certainly has some good aspects to it. So this one isn't well known, so I highly doubt that you'd come across this one. But in the chance that you're like, hey, I want some interesting series, and you do what I did a while back, which is pull up the tier list made by the guy that made Bugbo, you might see this thing called the Wilberg Documents. And I'm just gonna kindly tell you to avoid it at all costs. Generally speaking, I like to speak praise about small creators, because I'm a small creator, and every nice word feels great to hear. I like hearing feedback, and if someone's like, hey man, I've been excited for this upload and I really liked what you did, thanks for that. I mean, it genuinely can make my fucking day that people actually want to watch this stuff. So when it comes to small creators, yeah, I like to speak praise. But unfortunately, the Wilberg Documents it's a series not deserving of the slightest bit of praise. Do you find caretakers everywhere at the end of time scary? Now, there's nothing wrong if you do. In fact, It means that this will just scare the shit out of you. But, yeah. So, this series / video just can't shut the fuck up with its use of caretakers. Yeah, I mean, caretakers is a great project, but if you don't like them, or if you like them, I guess, Wilburg is just going to be a very bizarre experience because it will not shut the fuck up. It just keeps using it. And I'd love to say that, like, oh, it sets a cool tone, but no, it doesn't. It's just repetitive as shit. And the thing is, the substance outside of that isn't good either. It's just generic bad analog horror. I'm sure that it's someone's passion project, and I'm sure that they're very proud of it. But the thing is, there's not much to be proud of. Next up's another obscure one, but it's kind of this weird thing that I want to talk about because this is a comedy analog horror that just does not work, man. I'm sorry to the people that made it. I'd totally hang out with them, I think. But the Hot Dog Archives is not worth your time, man. Hot Dog Archives has deeply impacted me as a person. Not really, but it did kind of break me a little bit, as for some reason now I've just got this running joke reference to this one scene, which I'll have played now.
Oh shit, he got in!
Oh hey man, you want some of this?
Yeah, analog horror and comedy is not something that I necessarily recommend mixing, because it just sounds very difficult to do. And the times that I have chuckled at intentionally amusing moments in analog horror, the comedy is not the priority of the series or the episode or whatever. It's just kind of a fun little side thing.
Those are pigs.
Hot Dog Archives does not know how to do this. The guys are not experienced in creating analog horror, and it shows, as it's just about as generic as it can get. And not in the way of, haha, let's make fun of the genre. In the way of, I don't know, this sounds fine. Yeah, I think I saw that in this episode of this show. Yeah, though, I don't know. Hot Dog Archives, I just feel like should be avoided, so I want to put it out there. As I said at the beginning of the video, analog horror is something that's impacted me as a person, as it's a piece of horror that got me into what I'm into now. It's a foundational part of why I like horror and my tastes as a horror fan. Analog horror really can do a lot of interesting stuff when it wants to. It can also be bland as fuck and boring as hell, but you know, the moments of gold really do make the genre a great piece of the horror scene. Even if the community's toxic as fuck. There's a lot of stuff out there, you know? I mean, all you gotta do is look up an analog horror playlist and you'll find so much. And it's interesting. It really is an interesting scene. And hopefully this video, as I said at the beginning of the video, has either entertained those who are already into this and are happy to hear some smaller ones shouted out, and also Pierce about some of the bigger ones briefly. But also, hopefully, I've introduced some people to some new series that they haven't known about yet. And hopefully I'll be able to get a couple people into analog horror with this video. It's an interesting world, and there's a lot to it that isn't talked about. So hopefully I've informed you, hopefully I've entertained you, and hopefully you have the best of days. I'm Ghost, I'm your host, and I'm tired, so I'm gonna go take a nap. Bye-bye now.